hello there. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Casey and I'm the designer behind the indie sewing pattern company Pattern Scout. Fall has descended upon Michigan and it is quite beautiful, but with the changing leaves comes a change in my wardrobe. And I've got a small pile of mending and altering projects that I need to get to, a couple of things for myself, one thing for my husband. So I thought I would just share that here with you today on the channel. And later in this episode, I'm gonna give you a little sneak peek of some things that I've got coming down the Pattern Scout pipeline, a couple of bigger projects that I'm working on and planning for that I'm very excited about, and I think you'll like them too. And I also, it's been probably 2 or 3 months ago now, but a while back I found an amazing haul of vintage patterns at my local thrift store. So I'll share some of the patterns that I found there, some of the things that are inspiring me lately. So yeah, I'm just doing things a little different today. I'm gonna try a few little things and I hope you'll stick around. Okay, let's get started. A little while back, I found these really cute, dark forest green jeans at the thrift store, and they fit pretty good except for in the waist. They were a little bit big in the back, which is a common problem for me with ready-to-wear jeans. And then the ankles were a little bit too wide for my liking. I think I wanted these to be more like skinny jeans, and these are a little bit more like a straight cut. So they've got a little bit of stretch, and I think that they'll be really comfortable as a pair of skinny jeans. And you can see they're pretty wide and they stick out in the back, which I don't like. While I was wearing these, I just marked the amount of fabric that I needed to take off the waistband. And it's okay that this isn't really perfect. I just kind of want to get a general measurement here. Now I just need to remove the waistband, but I'm only going to remove the waistband about 2 to 3 inches beyond that center back seam on either side. Just enough to give me access to that center back seam of the yoke. I'm using my seam ripper to carefully remove all of the top stitching on the bottom edge of the waistband and detach it from the top edge of that yoke on the pants. I also need to remove this belt loop here, and this one's a little bit harder to get off because it is attached with bar tacks on both the top and the bottom. And I can just set that aside for now. Next, I want to remove the top stitching from the center back seam of the yoke. I'm doing this from the interior of the garment just to make sure that I only remove the top stitching and not the seam. I've also only removed it down to where the yoke meets the pants leg on the back. Now I'm going to cut my waistband right in the center and turn the pants inside out so that I can get better access to that center back yoke seam that I just removed the top stitching from. I'm folding that yoke seam nice and flat on the center back there, and I'm just going to stitch the amount of width that I need to take out of the waistband into the yoke. I'm basically just creating a dart that is hidden in the yoke seam here. I'll trim and finish this edge, probably with a serger, and then I'm just going to go over here and redo the top stitching on the top of that yoke, just to recreate that look and blend it into the top stitching of the bottom of the yoke. I'm measuring the width that I marked on the waistband that I need to take out, and I'm also taking out that top stitching up on the top of the waistband. And here I'm just matching up those 2 waistband edges, the raw edges, where I cut the waistband apart, and I'm going to pin those in place, making sure to match up the fold lines from the previous construction. Then I'll take that over to the sewing machine and sew about a 1/2 inch seam allowance here to reconnect the waistband at the center back. With the waistband reconnected, I'm just going to fold it back over that original seam allowance and pin it in place so that I can top stitch the waistband back to the pants. And I'm making sure to line up the waistband on both the interior and on the exterior, so that when I sew this, I'll catch both the interior and exterior of the waistband in my stitching. I'm also moving kind of slowly over that center back seam because it is quite bulky and I don't want to break a needle. And there you can see up close how that looks on the interior and the exterior. Now I can reattach the belt loop that I removed, and I'm just pinning it in place in the center here, and I'm going to sew that on with 2 bar tacks, again at the top and the bottom of this belt loop. And to create a bar tack, I'm just doing a very narrow zigzag stitch with a very short stitch length, which will keep the belt loop very secure. And the belt loop hides that seam that we created on the waistband. For the pants legs, I again marked how much I needed to take out of the ankle width, and I'm going to turn the pants inside out and take in the seam, tapering it back to the original seam line about halfway up the leg. I'll do this on both sides of the leg equally. And the reason you want to do it equally on either side of the pants leg is because you want to maintain the grain line of the fabric to prevent the fabric from warping or twisting while you're wearing the pants. I'll try these on to double check the fit, and then I'll go back in and trim and clean up that edge with a serger. This is the Jessica blazer by Closet Core Patterns, and I love this blazer. I've actually gotten quite a bit of wear out of it. However, when I originally made this blazer, it had shoulder pads, and over time I decided I didn't actually like the shoulder pads, so I took those out because it kind of made me feel like my shoulders were super broad, and even without the shoulder pads, I just feel like the shoulders are too wide, so I want to take those in a little bit. To do this, I'm just going to move the shoulder seam in at the top of the shoulder just about a ½ inch. So I'm marking here on the front bodice how far I want to take that in, and I'm tapering it back to about the center of the front armhole. This will be my new stitch line, and this line is just a reference for me to use for sewing. I'm doing the same thing on the back of the shoulder, but I'm only bringing that down about maybe 2 inches and tapering it back to the armhole because I don't want to make the back too narrow. I actually like the way the back fits across the shoulders here. I'll use my seam ripper to open up the top of the shoulder seam here, and I'm only doing the top of the shoulder seam just along those areas where I want to reposition the shoulder. I don't want to do the whole arm side. And I just plan to reattach the sleeve cap along that reference line. I'll be sewing this by hand, so I grabbed a needle and some heavy duty thread. I had some of this Gutermann Mara 70 thread from some jeans making projects that I've done. It's a jeans top stitching thread, and that's what I'll be using to reattach the sleeve. After threading, I'm running the threads through my hands a little bit to sort of relax them and prevent bunching. And I create a knot in the end of the thread by wrapping it around my finger a couple of times, rolling it off, and then pulling the knot tight. That's my little knot tying trick. I'm inserting the needle first through the wrong side of the garment on the interior of the garment here, making sure to only catch the blazer material and not the lining. And then I'm just going to reattach the sleeve here with a ladder stitch. So I'm going in one side, creating a stitch, then going straight across to the other side, creating a stitch, and going back and forth that way to join the two pieces together. I'm also maintaining the original seam allowance of the sleeve cap, which is actually quite narrow because I did trim the seam after I constructed this, but I'm making a deeper seam allowance on the bodice side where I drew that reference line in blue. I'll continue this ladder stitch along the entire top of the sleeve cap and make sure that I check the distribution of the sleeve cap along the arm side occasionally just to make sure that there's no weird bunching and that everything is laying nice and flat. When I first started this, my technique was a little bit awkward, but by the time I reached the end, I kind of figured out that if you pinch the two sides together like I'm doing now, you can start to, it just makes it easier to get that ladder stitch in there and make sure that you're keeping the seam allowances aligned. When I reach the end, I will tie a knot in my thread, and then to conceal the thread at the end, I'm just going to poke my needle through that seam and kind of come out about 1 inch away, pull that tight, and then I will trim that, and then the end of that thread tail will be hidden on the inside of the jacket. I'll do this for the other sleeve and I'll be done. Looks pretty good. Last but not least, I need to patch this hole in my husband's jeans. And I found this kind of light blue-gray thread in my stash that I'll use to attach the patch. I'm cutting a piece of old denim. I've got some old pairs of jeans that my husband has let me use as patching materials. So I'm cutting a piece of that to cover the hole, plus a lot extra around the exterior of the hole. Now I'm going to turn the jeans inside out so that I can place that patch on the interior of the jeans. I've grabbed my bag of random interfacing scraps And I happen to have just a tiny little piece of a fusible interfacing that's fusible on both sides. I honestly can't even remember what type of interfacing this is. I just know it's very thin and it will adhere two pieces of fabric together. So I'm taking this over to the ironing board, placing that patch on top of the interfacing over the hole and ironing this really well to fuse those pieces together. And I'm trimming here, just kind of curving around the corners so there's not any like pokey edges on the inside. I decided to sew this on my sewing machine because these jeans are actually wide enough that I can get them over the throat of my sewing machine here, or the arm, I guess I should say. And I'm kind of freehand sewing this using my back stitch to go back and forth. But you could also hand stitch this. It might actually be a little bit easier, to be honest, and you could still get a great result. And there you can see that thread is barely visible. I also did the same thing around the entire perimeter of that patch. So I know that not much has changed for this reveal. However, I think that we can all agree that when your clothes fit well, you just feel good. And that is the beauty of being able to sew and alter your clothing. Now, the things that I'm very excited about. A couple of years ago, my timeline might be a little bit off, but at least a year and a half ago, I made myself a puffy coat. And it was just a really popular project. People have messaged me a lot about this project over the years, over the year and a half, 2 years since I made it. And I got so much use out of that coat. I wore it constantly. It is just a super practical make, and it was difficult to make. I say difficult. It was a little bit challenging to make, but it was very rewarding when I finished it. And like I said, I wore it constantly. That coat has a lot of character. So it was definitely something that I made not knowing a lot about the technical fabrics that I was working with. And I kind of kept it really simple. I didn't add too many bells and whistles. So I've been wanting to make another one that fits a little bit better, has more pockets, and has a hood, things like that. So this fabric doesn't look very exciting on here, but this is what I'm going to be making my puffy coat out of. And I picked this fabric up at Ripstop by the Roll. They have an awesome selection of ripstop fabrics. The brand is Hyper D, and it's like the 1.6 ounce, I think. And it's just a really soft ripstop nylon. It's a lot easier to sew with. To me, it seems like it is than other ripstop nylons. It doesn't slip quite as much. So I'm going to be making a kind of olive green puffy coat out of this. And I'm going to be documenting the entire process because I documented the process of the first one over on my Instagram stories. And like I said, it was pretty rough. I mean, I definitely got the point across, but I've been wanting to do another one that is a lot more detailed and just a better overall design of the coat and all the details and everything. So I'm going to be working on that. That should be coming soonish this winter for sure, showing you all how to make your own puffy coat if that's something that you're interested in. Okay, next, and the last fabric actually. So I picked up this really cool houndstooth plaid fabric from Seams Fabric. Seams is a local fabric shop here in East Lansing actually. And she has a nice little selection of vintage fabrics. I think she might be discontinuing the vintage section or just not putting as much focus on it, but I have found some really cool fabrics in her vintage section. So this is the fabric that she found at either an estate sale or maybe a thrift store, and yeah, I snagged it up. So I've only got 2 yards of this, but it's pretty wide. I think it's like at least 60 inches wide. And I've been wanting to make myself a wool coat. I really love sewing outerwear. I've made myself a lot of coats. Every winter, I kind of go coat crazy. And I'm like, this winter, this is the winter that I'm gonna make myself the perfect coat. And I just keep going. I love it so much. So planning to make a coat out of this. And that brings me to this vintage pattern haul that I got. So I went to the thrift store a few months ago and picked up probably about 20 patterns. Originally, when I was looking through their patterns, they probably had like 300 vintage patterns. Someone just like dropped off a whole haul of vintage patterns. They were only 50 cents a piece. When I first was going through them, I was like, heck yeah. And I had like 50 patterns in my cart. And then I was like, okay, I need to quit being so stingy and like put some of these back, because a lot of them too were just a repeat of the same pattern, even with different pattern designers, just a decade apart. You know, a lot of these styles come back into style anyway. So I put most of those back and I ended up with about 20 patterns. But one in particular that I'm really excited about is this McCall's 6813. And this is a set, a 3-piece set that goes together. I love the pattern for the coat because it is kind of a blazer style, like a long blazer style coat. So I think if I have enough of this houndstooth plaid fabric, I'm going to use that for this coat. If I don't have enough of this, then I think I'm going to use this Butterick 3938 pattern that I found that's just like a really simple blazer with patch pockets. I think it would be perfect for this fabric. And I love that I can use a vintage fabric with a vintage pattern. I think that's really cool. So I'm very excited to sew that, and I plan to share that process here on the YouTube channel as well. One way or the other, I'm gonna find a way to make a coat out of this plaid houndstooth fabric because it's just so awesome and so classic, such a classic fabric. But yeah, these are pretty fun and lots of inspiration in here. Okay. Also, all of these vintage patterns kind of remind me of my grandmother. So my grandmother is the person that taught me how to sew. She was an avid maker in every sense of the word. She loved to sew, loved to cook, loved to just make things with her hands. And she was just such a huge influence on me as a child when I was learning how to sew. I think having that experience as a child was just so formative and so positive, and it's made me such a confident creative now. So looking through all of these vintage patterns, it just reminds me so much of my grandmother. Pretty much every time I sit down to sew, I think about my grandmother. It's very nostalgic for me. Okay, I think that's all I've got for you today. Thank you for watching. I was kind of trying some new things today. Thought I'd switch it up a little bit. And yeah, I'm just having a blast creating these tutorials for you guys, and I really appreciate you being here and watching. If you've made it this far, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and let me know in the comments below what you thought about this video, or just let me know what you'd like to see next. I will see you in the next video. Bye.